Hello, welcome back to another update as we cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. We start out in the direction of Synkivka, where although there hasn't been any territorial changes, we do have this very detailed video which shows the Russian armored assault that allowed them to get the foothold here within Synkivka, after which the Ukrainian forces counterattacked and managed to regain control over the village. So the assault itself started out with multiple Russian armored vehicles, including BMPs and tanks, driving in from the forest lines here to the northwest of the village, into the village from this opening. They drive down into the village, they drop off a few of their infantry as soon as they get inside the village. They form formations to prevent direct fire from hitting the infantry that are dismounting the vehicles, but they are detected by Ukrainian UAVs waiting for them. They drop grenades on these soldiers, and there's a BMP on the Ukrainian side that drives up to the Russian positions to try and get some of these infantry that are dismounting. There's also Ukrainian soldiers within the village that are looking at the positions the Russian forces dismounted from. The issue with this type of frontal assault is that there is clear overview over where these infantry are, which houses they go inside of. So unless these armored vehicles stay for fire support, the Russian forces are not going to have a good time trying to occupy these positions within the village. So this is the main issue with this assault. It is that after the soldiers were dismounted, the vehicles just drive off. They leave the village, leaving these infantry for themselves to try and hold on to their position. This raises the question, why did they leave? Why is there a lack of proper air support? Where's all the Russian drones and so many other things that isn't clearly shown in this footage? Why are these drones, why are these armored vehicles, why are these tanks, why are these BMPs driving off, leaving the Russian soldiers to fend for themselves? All of this leads to the Ukrainian counterattack that recaptures the northern outskirts of the village. Following this video, which happened 10 days ago on the 14th of December, the Russian forces movement was geolocated to show how they entered the northwestern outskirts of the village. They drove into this central part with multiple buildings in the intersection. Then they dismounted the infantry and drove back. There was one that moved straight to the left to cover from the open field and then moved back. And all of these armored vehicles just retreat back into the forest areas, leaving the soldiers by themselves within the village. It seems that the Russian forces who were recently rotated in a couple of weeks ago in this direction could have been the ones who carried out this mission, because to be honest, it is very difficult to not call this sort of operation incompetent, considering that they ended up using a couple of armored vehicles and infantry to gain nothing in the end, simply to leave them behind within the village at the mercy of a Ukrainian BMP. They didn't even get to properly set in and dig into new positions before they were abandoned by the armored vehicles, which raises the question, why did this happen? Is this the general strategy of the Russian forces? Because if so, it is fairly incompetent. We then move on to a section of the front line where the Russians are having much more success, but we've also seen a Ukrainian counterattack. First off, in the direction of Bakhmut, we've seen that the Russian forces have managed to capture the forest line here to the west of the village. They are now fighting within this big forest patch here to the west of the village, but the areas here to the northwest have been captured by the Russian forces, solidifying their control over the northern parts of the village as they've managed to advance further within it as well. So we're seeing that the Russian forces are focusing a lot of units here in this direction, getting a proper foothold within Bakhmut. So we can see here that the strategy may be similar, but likely the armored vehicles in support of the Russian forces don't just abandon them as soon as they enter the village, which is likely why they're having much more success here in this direction, where they over multiple days have managed to advance day by day, getting further positions within the village over the past 3 days, and now having a proper foothold by the intersection and the forest lines here in the northern parts. However, south of that by the railways, there's been a lot of fighting on the Ukrainian side, trying to recapture some territories. They first managed to recapture these forest lines here by the railways themselves, and now they've managed to recapture the cemetery and other areas to the southeast of Bakhmut, southwest of Romove. And fighting continues here, as it is reported that 2 Ukrainian battalions were sent to deal with this and launch this counterattack to prevent a collapse of the front here in the Bakhmut direction. They must have watched my video talking about it to realize that the situation is critical and have since sent reinforcements to supply the area and reinforce the area. And as such, we see that they've managed to recapture some positions. However, heavy fighting continues, so we'll see who comes out on top in the end. As for the western parts of Bakhmut, we've seen some further Russian advances. These are in the direction of Ivanivska and to the southwest of the Dacha area in the direction of Synkivka. The Russian forces in this direction are also increasing their efforts in trying to push westwards. There's also been some reports of fighting here by the west of Romove in the direction of Ivanivska here as well. So we're seeing constant efforts by Russian forces to continue pushing in the direction of Ivanivska to the west of Bakhmut, as well as in the direction of Synkivka, where fighting is going on and taking place in the forest areas to the north and to the west of the village. All of these are clear indication that a lot of Russian forces have been relocated to this section of the front line as fighting continues in this direction. And there's a lot of efforts by the Russian forces, a lot of reinforcements being sent to this place to increase their zone of control and continue their operations that ended with the start of the Ukrainian offensive. So we're seeing that there's this constant small-scale offensive of the Russian forces, where a large amount of soldiers across the whole front line do these small operations day by day, trying to capture a few fortifications or houses every day, where the Russian forces are simply trying to make use of the superior firepower and the amount of reinforcements that have been arriving in the country since the start of the year to try and gain some sort of advantage by the front line and make this small-scale advance. This is what I refer to as the lack of any genius in this war. Instead of attempting large-scale operations where they try to cut off enemy forces, where they try to gain the upper hand through sheer strategy, rather than using just by-the-book strategies, tactical, that isn't really that special, but instead just exactly as is written in their doctrine. This raises the question as to, is either side of this conflict really that competent? We're seeing that the generals from each side don't seem to be making any significant progress. Unlike what we saw at the very start of the war, where large-scale operations were taking place, huge territories were shifting hands, everyone goes with the argument, well, the Russians are just trying to grind down the Ukrainian army, and the Ukrainians are trying for territory, which is what we've seen with their successes in Kharkiv and Kherson and their failure in Zaporizhia. However, we also see there that they aren't really taking that risky moves. They're instead going the safest direction they can every time, which is why we're seeing this very slow progress on both sides. So this raises the question, is it because they are afraid of the consequences of losing, or is it because they simply do not have the strategic capacity to actually get an advantage on the front line? Because all we are seeing really is soldiers going to the front and using their weapons to shoot at their opponent. That is basically what war is, yes. But war also includes the strategic perspective, where soldiers don't just go to the front line and have a shoot-off, a 1v1 battle, as you say in video games, but instead that it is a team game, and we lack seeing that here. We see that tanks send soldiers to the front line and leave them. That is not what war is about. War is about using the different aspects you have together to gain an advantage. The Russians have a significant advantage in both material, soldiers, amount of soldiers, as well as the technologies that they have available in large numbers. The Ukrainians are scraping by with whatever they are able to get their hands on. This is clearly an uneven balance, yet the Russians are not able to take advantage of that. They instead just take every single 1v1 battle as it is, instead of taking the whole picture, taking the whole front line, and getting an advantage on all of it together. Seems as if it is the command that is more incompetent than anything else really in the end. At the very least, the Russian army decides to do something and it just goes ahead and does it. In a very simple manner, yes, but they do it. Instead, the Ukrainians prefer PR and perception over the reality of the situation and what actually needs to be done to win a war. And this is why, despite the Russian failures, the Ukrainian failures overshadow them completely, with the amount of troops lost in these operations, like in the Zaporizhia front, completely eclipse what the Russians have been losing so far in their own operations, although we have seen dozens of armored vehicles as well as hundreds of infantry being lost. It is nowhere near what the Ukrainians claim that the Russians are losing, and the Russian soldiers end up increasing in a very higher rate than what we see the Ukrainians do. And this is what is worrying a lot of Western analysts. They believe that at the current rate, at the current situation, the Russian forces simply have too much of an advantage when it comes to growth than the Ukrainians do, due to the slow help and limited help of Western countries and the limited capacity of Ukraine itself. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.